the concept of, using the natural ecology of a forest to inform your management goes way back. And in the Phil's talk, I gave some examples like papers from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and ecological forestry.
Yeah, that far back. 100 years ago.
Yeah, 100 years ago, they were talking about this, an ecological basis of forestry. I mean, that's like, getting onto early when the, ecology as a concept and as a discipline was relatively young still.
Yeah.
So, but the idea then was that it would be a good way to grow trees efficiently.
Right.
So the objective at that time was not this whole sustainable diversity of values concept. It was just that trees grow. Look, we have trees. They're growing really well.
Yeah.
What is it about the way that they are put together by nature that makes them grow that well, and how can we learn that?
What's happening, everyone? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is all about the big picture of forest management, the big picture of forest harvest, and the actual strategies we use, the concepts we use to harvest the forest in a sustainable way. And we're going to be talking a lot about the concept of emulating natural disturbance. So what that means is that for a long time, we thought that, if we can emulate, if we can copy natural disturbance, if we can do our forest harvest the way, say, a fire does, or wind throw, or something like that, if we can copy that, then we will be ecologically sound, we will be creating healthy forests, we will be doing this in a sustainable way. And up until very recently, that concept hasn't really been challenged. It's just kind of been a hypothesis. That's what we've been doing or trying to do. And I wanted to bring somebody in to talk about that. So I brought in someone who has spent their entire research career studying forest disturbance, whether it be human disturbance or natural disturbance, whether it's fire or mining or logging or whether it's whatever. And her name is Ellen Macdonald. She is a professor emeritus of forest ecology and plant biodiversity at the University of Alberta. She is the exact right person to talk about this. When I first thought up the idea for this episode, I was listening to a lecture series put out by the University of Alberta. It is called the Forest Industry Lecture Series. It's out there on the U of A website for people to watch. You can watch her lecture. And it was talking about this. Should we really be emulating natural disturbance? And she gave this whole talk about whether or not we were doing a good job. What were the ramifications of this? What should we maybe be doing differently? What was good? What was bad? All that stuff. And so I wanted to bring her on to do it again. I wanted to bring her on to kind of pontificate a little bit on these ideas and to talk about the concept of emulating natural disturbance and what we've learned from it. So it was a great conversation. Ellen's awesome. She's been on a couple times. So you might recognize her voice. She's great. I really enjoy talking to Ellen. She's just so well-reasoned and thoughtful, and she's just easy to talk to and a lot of fun. So, sponsors for 2024. West Fraser is the number one. Without them, this would not be possible. Thank you, West Fraser, for all of your support over the years. It's been fantastic. I look forward to keeping it going. Green Lake Forestry is the only other sponsor. They've been with me since the beginning. Again, would not be possible without them. Thank you, Green Lake. Now, let's dive into this concept of how should we be thinking about forest harvest? What should we be doing? How should we be conceptualizing it? How can we maybe do it differently? Here we go. All right, so thanks for coming here again. Third time's the charm. We got the first. I was looking back. I was like, when was the first time I recorded with Ellen? And it was episode 21. So it was like the first year I did this. It was like 2017 or 2018. It would have been, and then we did one over COVID, and then so this one I'm looking forward to this one because I feel like this one it's like a culmination of your entire career into one.
That's daunting.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I wanted to bring you in to talk about this concept of emulating natural disturbance and what we've been trying to do. That forestry has been trying to emulate natural disturbance in an attempt to be more ecologically sound or whatever it might be. And you gave this talk at the Forest Industry Lecture Series at the University of Alberta, talking about how maybe we should get away from that idea. And so, yeah, I wanted to bring you in, talk about that concept a little bit and explore it, because I think it's an interesting idea. And there's so much to unpack there in, like, how did we get to this point and where do we go from here? And it's just, so I wanted to do that. First of all, if you don't mind, can you just give me a quick brief summary of your background, kind of like your knowledge base, so people know, where you're coming from when we have this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Ellen Macdonald, I am now Professor Emeritus at University of Alberta, Department of Renewable Resources. So officially I'm retired, but I haven't finished working. Yeah. So I'm doing the emeritus thing.
I recently found out that apparently there's the emeritus, there's a male and female correct version.
Yes, I read about that too. It's supposed to be emerita is female because of the Latin origin. I did a lot of reading on this before I changed my email signature.
Right.
And I somehow felt like it was really stupid to be emerita because everybody calls them emeritus. And then somewhere I read that for this particular use of the word for talking about a professor that's retired but still active, emeritus is acceptable for a female. So I decided to stick with emeritus.
So whatever floats your boat. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. I've never seen any academic female that I'm aware of that retired and called themselves emerita.
Never heard of it.
No.
Honestly, until I listened to this one talk, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't even know it was an option. But,
yeah. So I'm not a fan of gender-specific words anyway, so I'm just going to stick with emeritus.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Moving on. So your background anyways. Yeah.
So, I grew up in London, Ontario and Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. And then I went to university at University of Calgary, did an undergraduate degree in environmental biology, which is basically an ecology undergrad degree. And then, I got very interested in plant ecology, went straight into a PhD there. Working on a variety of different ecosystems and looking at how plants adapt to different conditions. And then immediately after my PhD, I got an opportunity to come to the U of A as a postdoc in what was then the Department of Forest Science, and worked with Rich Rothwell and Vic Liefers primarily. Okay. And then a year in, a couple people left. Cor Hellam was a silviculture professor, retired, and Kent Higginbotham left to go to the provincial government at that time. And so there was openings, and I managed to get a faculty position.
Nice.
So I was extremely lucky. Straight PhD, 1 year postdoc, and a faculty position. And that was, I started my faculty position in 1989.
Okay. Yeah.
So I had, 34 years flew by after that.
Yeah. And most of your research over that time, how would you summarize your area of expertise, your research area?
So, boreal forests almost exclusively, a little bit of montane forests and occasional trips into the above tree line stuff, alpine and Arctic, but primarily boreal forest, focused primarily on plants, but interactions of plants in those ecosystems, looking at the dynamics of forest, so disturbance and regeneration and how they change over time, how that relates between the trees and the understory plant community, how the understory plant community relates to the soil, and then in particular looking at effects of disturbance, harvesting disturbance, but also fire, and doing a bit of work on, mining disturbance. So restoration focused work. Just seeing how all those systems work, and then really trying to take what we learn from natural disturbance and apply it to, management or restoration of forests.
Right.
So.
really getting a good view of all the different types of disturbances, natural or anthropogenic, and just like comparing them and really getting a good idea for how this is all related.
Really, how do forests work? How do they keep themselves going, over time and function and give us, all those values that we want from those forests and that they've had operating for a long time. So,
luckily we have a word for that, right?
Yeah.
Ecology.
Yeah, exactly.
You can sum all that up in ecology, but it's good to describe it actually. And it really makes it clear in your mind, right? So, no, that's fantastic. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. So, I think it's important to have that so people understand your background, where you're coming from. So going into this conversation, there's a little more weight behind the words, right? So, so I do want to start with, I did this with Ira as well. One of the previous ones was, I kind of want to get your definition, or maybe not your definition, but your idea, your concept of sustainable forest management, and what is the goal of that, and maybe how you think that's changed over time.
I think my definition now, and I think it's a wide-held definition of sustainable forest management, is managing our forests in a way that sustain the full diversity of values that they have. So we're, in some cases we might not be managing for timber extraction at all. For sometimes we would be, but we want to have, all those values. So we want to have the biodiversity. We want to have the ecological function, the hydrology, the nutrient cycling, the dynamics of soil development, all those things, but then other non-tangible values. So spiritual values, aesthetic values that Indigenous peoples and communities have of those forests. So trying to maintain all of that in these forests that we're managing, air quotes, interacting with in different ways. And, sometimes even not doing anything is managing, protecting from fire is managing. All those things are managing. So, and, I think one of the main ways that definition has changed really was, the start of the ecosystem-based management. So I would say 30, 40 years ago, this switch from sustainable forest management being more sustained yield forestry. So it was about sustaining the timber resource, and that was the focus, to this switch to greater diversity of values from the forest. And that was sort of the sea change most recently in forest management.
Yeah. And that was it's funny too, because I think we often forget that the sustained yield model, although we look back on it now thinking like, just sustaining the trees wasn't enough. At the time, it was revolutionary, right? It was really like, you're like, we're going to make sure that we always have trees. That seems like a really good idea. But now, obviously, the science has progressed. We know a lot more. We're able to do so much more. And I see what you're saying exactly. Like, I completely agree with your definition of sustainable forest management, right? Like,
and I do agree with you too that sustained yield management was a really important step, because there's certainly historically many, many examples in the world where really forests were completely removed from the landscape because there wasn't that sustained yield perspective. So, lots of places we can go and they either have no forest where there used to be forest, or they have a forest that is nothing like what it was historically, because they've just replanted it, and they, in some places in the world, they don't actually know even what were the native species that grew in that location. So,
totally. Well, I mean, even in Canada,
that was critical. Like
we have eastern white pine is a perfect example of that, right? Like, first colonized and eastern white pine was wiped out, and it still exists, but not nearly to the extent that it did. And that was an example of take it and go, right? Like, so
build masts for ships and we're good.
Let's wage war and call it a day. I totally agree. Like, I think that the idea of sustainable forest management, maintaining those values, and I think even to expand on your point too, is not just to maintain those values in the landscape, but to ensure that they are not degrading, and maybe even improving those values as time goes on, like non-timber values. Who knows what we might be improving habitat, improving opportunity for a spiritual connection, or whatever it might be, right? I think that's like you said, that's also part of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it is just, maintaining them into the future, ensuring that they will be there in the future. And like you said, in some cases, improving them, or, restoring them, and
restoring,
not so much in Canada, but there's lots of places in the world where there's a big focus on restoring these values to forests where they have been lost because of past management practices. So
totally. Yeah. No, I like that.
That's another component. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. I love that. I just wanted to get that on the table so we know what we're talking about here. And then, we talked a little bit about how that has changed over time, from sustained yield to today to the future changing again, right? We're here to talk about the concept of emulating natural disturbance with forest harvest. So the whole idea is that we would emulate fire in some way, and this might be more ecologically sound or something. So anyways, I want to talk about this idea. Where did this idea come from of you emulating natural disturbance as a means of being more sustainable in some way in the forest harvest strategy? Yeah.
So it seemed, it originated really in two places. I'll digress in a moment, but most recently, this idea originated in two places, which was in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. with Jerry Franklin, talking about an ecological or an ecosystem approach to managing forests that was motivated by this desire to have, a forest management practices that sustain a full range of values.
That was a long time ago, right?
Late 1980s, early 1990s. Okay, I
thought it was even before that.
Not long ago. Yeah. And then there was Mac Hunter at the University of Maine, who also wrote about this concept and, gave some solid examples of how we would use, say, age distribution on the landscape of forests under a natural disturbance regime and try and mimic that or emulate that with, the way we planned harvesting rotations. Sure. So those two ideas came there and they really followed on, the movement towards sustainable management and, concepts of sustainability more broadly, environmental sustainability, the various UN conferences, the Montreal Conference, and where
the term sustainability was coined or whatever. Yeah.
Where the term was coined and, the ecosystem management or ecosystem-based management actually predates that. And I talked about that in my Phil's talk. So the earlier, references to ecosystem management were in aquatic ecosystems and talking about invasive species and a holistic approach to dealing with some of those issues. But then pretty quickly it became this, big thing in forestry. And, so in my mind, it very quickly went from this concept of ecosystem management or ecosystem-based management to emulation of natural disturbance.
Very quickly, okay.
Yeah, very quickly and almost to the point where they became synonymous with one another.
Right.
And that's sort of part of what I felt needed a bit of critical thought because I thought that, ecosystem-based management was management approaches that understood and appreciated how ecosystems function and embraced that and tried to maintain that.
Okay.
And then emulation of natural disturbance really was a way to achieve the goals of ecosystem-based management.
Okay.
But
it was a tactic.
It was it was a tool. It was a tool for achieving that goal.
Okay.
The goal of sustaining the diversity of forest values, the goal of managing forests in a way where we would understand, appreciate, and use our knowledge of the ecology of forests to manage them in this sustainable way.
Still a hypothesized tool.
Yeah, exactly. It's a hypothesized way of how we could get there.
Right.
But it seemed like amongst practitioners and even in my mind amongst, academics that I talked to, they would just synonymize this ecosystem-based management, natural disturbance-based management. They're the same thing.
Okay.
And, that's really what I wanted. I've thought about this for quite a few years actually and talked to colleagues and, argued back and forth a little bit. And that's what I thought really needed some thought and that I wanted to talk about in the Phil's talk.
Yeah.
But to digress a little bit, the concept of, using the natural ecology of a forest to inform your management goes way back. And in the Phil's talk, I gave some examples like papers from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and ecological forestry.
That far back. 100 years ago.
Yeah, 100 years ago, they were talking about this, an ecological basis of forestry. I mean, that's like, getting onto early when the, ecology as a concept and as a discipline was relatively young still.
Yeah.
So, but the idea then was, that it would be a good way to grow trees efficiently.
Right.
So the objective at that time was not this whole sustainable diversity of values concept. It was just that trees grow. Look, we have trees. They're growing really well.
Yeah.
What is it about the way that they are put together by nature that makes them grow that well, and how can we learn that?
The idea was nature knows best. Let's do that.
Yeah, it was the nature knows best way. Okay. So at that time, it still had this idea of understanding how forests function naturally, what happens when they're disturbed, how the species regenerate after a disturbance, how, you have either, forests with dominated by one tree species or by a diversity of tree species, and what that all means in terms of how they grow.
Right.
And using that to inform your silviculture to grow trees.
Yes. Okay.
So that idea was there way back when.
Yeah.
And then it just, and then I would say maybe it slightly got lost in the meantime there with a more, move to more intensive approaches to,
how fast can we grow them?
How fast can we grow these trees, and that we can maybe grow them faster, not following the natural way.
Right.
And then kind of came around again as this ecological approach, with a different objective, with this broader objective. Yeah.
Once we got really, really, really good at growing trees quickly, we're kind of like, whoa, let's dial it.
Now we're growing trees, and maybe, what's our cost in terms of what else we're losing from the forest? Yeah. That's where those concerns came from. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, no, when I think back on my formal education at the U of A, like I think I totally, like you said, the terms ecological forestry or ecosystem-based forest management and natural disturbance, emulating natural disturbance, they were the one and the same in my mind. Like I definitely was treating, I was like, we totally, if we can imitate fire, then that's going to be ecologically sound. And it was kind of a hypothesis that I think up until very recently was more or less unchallenged. We were kind of like, this seems to be going pretty well. Obviously with forests being, slow to return, our feedback is kind of slow. It takes time to figure out exactly how it's affecting the landscape. We obviously, the intent was to do ecosystem-based management. The expected outcome was that would be the most ecologically sound way of doing it. So in the boreal forest, we're trying to emulate fire, right? That was the main idea. Maybe we'll start to break down how that went by emulating natural disturbance. How did that go? What did we do specifically to try and do that, to try and maintain? And then we'll get into maybe how that differs from what it actually is. Yeah.
And so if you start at this as a hypothesis that if we make our forest management practices more like natural disturbance, then we'll maintain this diversity of values that's in forests, because forests get disturbed all the time, particularly, the boreal forest. It's very adapted to disturbance. It's been experiencing disturbance for millennia, and yet it grows and sustains biodiversity and does all these other functions and has all these other values that we appreciate. So it seems like a good idea. So then you go, okay, how are we going to do it?
Yeah.
And, they used to say that clear cutting was the only way to manage these forests because they were adapted to fire, and clear cutting was the closest thing to fire.
Right.
We used to hear that all the time.
Yeah.
That wasn't a good management system because it was emulating the natural disturbance. But
I definitely believed that for a long time.
Yeah.
It made sense. I was like, that seems logical.
I mean, in some superficial way, perhaps it's true, that, trees were adapted to generate in open conditions, for example.
Yeah. Aspen
or pine, something like that.
Sure.
They're adapted to that. But when you broaden it out past the trees and you look at it and you say, what are we going to do that's really like fire? What does fire really do?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
So, it kills the trees, but it doesn't remove them from the site. combusts the fine fuels, the needles and the branches. It combusts the forest floor, for example. But it leaves the boles of the trees behind.
Yeah.
You don't see a fire that completely consumes all the boles of the trees, right?
No, right.
So, in that way, it's fundamentally different than forest harvesting. And there's no natural disturbance that I can think of that really does what we do when we harvest a forest, which is remove the major bole biomass of the trees. Insects don't do it. Wind doesn't do it. Ice storms, fire, none of them, only us.
Yeah.
So as a starting point, you go, okay, we really can't.
Yeah.
Really, the concept of harvesting timber from a forest and emulating natural disturbance are incompatible with one another.
Exactly. If we believe that the concept of structural diversity affects the way that, the soil works and the way that plants grow, and having standing dead trees impacts how many birds are in the area, how many insects, how the nutrient cycling is happening, and we know that that's true, then we have to assume that, okay, so these are not the same things. A fire literally takes all the fine fuel, leaves all the big stuff, and we do the opposite.
Yeah.
So why do we assume that those are the same, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay. So,
totally,
so
that's one starting point. And then if you look at, the broaden out to the larger landscape scale in terms of how variable natural disturbances are in terms of frequency and the area that they affect, then you think, well, we could do that, but it's almost certainly we're not going to, right?
Right.
We're not going to harvest, 10 times more in one year than in another year.
Yeah.
We're not, we don't harvest randomly across the landscape.
Yeah.
Fire isn't completely random across the landscape, but fire affects a lot of components of the landscape
Much more random.
that we would never be harvesting, right?
Yeah, totally.
The spatial pattern of fire, some of those things we could kind of emulate, but some of them we couldn't, or we're never going to, we're never going to harvest, more than double the historical record of amount of forest that was ever disturbed like we had this past summer.
The fire we had, totally,
our 2023 fire season, right? It was, more than double anything in the past 30, 50 years.
Yeah.
So we're never going to do that. So, then you go, okay. So there's two major things with emulating natural disturbance that we can't or aren't going to do with forest harvesting.
Yeah. Well, even the soil, right?
Yeah.
Like a fire.
How soil is affected. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
If it's a low intensity fire or a high intensity fire, it's creating charring. It's having an impact on the soil. Whereas forest harvesting done in the wintertime is there's a little bit of compaction. But it's not, and maybe a little bit of tearing, but it's not like it's burning it or destroying it. It's still there. It's just been altered. So even that's a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So totally. Yeah. So
So there's
we were pretty selective about how we figured we were emulating natural disturbance, right? It's funny how we were just kind of like, we're emulating it.
Yeah.
Totally.
Vague,
yeah.
A bit vague. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you go, okay, what do we know? What can we do? And we know that one of the big things about natural disturbance, whether it be fire or insects, two major disturbances in the boreal, what do they do? Well, they leave stuff behind, right? They don't kill everything. They create dead wood.
Right.
They, create structure. They create opportunities for trees to regenerate and, end up resulting in structural diversity in the forest, multi-age structures, things like that. So then you go, okay, those kinds of things we can do with different silvicultural tools.
Totally.
So
for sure.
So I can start thinking about that, but then you go, okay, then we're not really emulating the effects of natural disturbance or emulating natural disturbance. We're being more purposeful in trying to create some particular structure, composition in the forest. Right. That's something that would occur naturally. Following on natural disturbance, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
But we're not really emulating the effect of the natural disturbance itself.
Yeah. It was a sound. I mean, I don't know if it was a sound concept, but it was a a concept created in the right spirit of creating sustainable forests, right? Like we were like, yeah, let's try this out.
Yeah.
And we've tried it out for a while and we're like, well, maybe we can do something else.
yeah. And I'm certainly not suggesting to throw it out.
Right. Yeah.
I just thought it needed a bit of a critique, right? Because as you said, it was a hypothesis that by doing this, we could get to where we wanted to go.
Yeah.
And then have we got there? Are we really doing it? Is this the best approach?
Yeah.
And, this idea that the means became the end.
Yes.
That our objective was to emulate natural disturbance, or I think our real objective should be back to sustainable forest management and to sustain. We want to do stuff that's going to sustain this diversity of values.
Totally.
And I don't think the only thing in our toolbox to get there is natural disturbance emulation, particularly now with all the challenges that we're faced with in our forests, with particularly climate change, invasive species, other kinds of industrial disturbance that's very severe, a very divided, busy landscape with lots of competing demands on it.
Yeah.
We need, a lot of different tools and creative ideas about how we can approach this and maintain, these forests and all those values that we want from them into the future. And, honestly, values that we haven't thought about a lot before. Yeah. So values of indigenous communities and peoples, spiritual, aesthetic values of forests. I don't think we've probably given very much or any attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in the plan, right? But it's not a focus. It's kind of it's in the plan as, hey, we're paying attention to these things, but it's not really. It's kind of more just part of the values that are accepted as part of the landscape. But hey, as long as we return the trees back, we're probably good.
Yeah, the idea is if we're putting trees back, then we get all that other stuff too. Is that true?
Comes with it.
Yeah, it comes with it, does it?
Yeah. Maybe not. And so I think it's. I found it's interesting to think that I feel like we're so much more, like you said, we have such an impact on the landscape, whether it's through putting roads through, building towns, well sites, whether it's through forest management, whether it's through hunters, whether it's through trappers, whether it's through whatever it might be. And we have so much knowledge now with science. We're really deep into the idea of starting to understand how the ecology of the forest works and the interaction and what's needed to make sure that, it stays robust over time. That I don't think we need to fall back. This is just my personal opinion, obviously, but I don't think we need to have this crutch of emulating natural disturbance anymore, of saying, we can be so much more intentional, right? We know the impacts that these things have. It's like, okay, now we can start really trying something different and not trying to pretend like we are fire. We can actually be like, no, we're people. We're definitely people.
We are people.
And let's act like people, and let's use the knowledge that people have to try and manage this a little more wisely, instead of trying to, because clearly this emulating natural disturbance thing, at least from my perspective and your perspective, maybe not going, it's not really emulating as much as we want. We're already being people. So let's be people a little bit more intentionally.
I guess that's true. Yeah. We are already being people. What we're doing is people things.
Yeah.
And
to be very scientific about it.
So let's get back to first principles and think, where are we trying to go?
Yeah.
And then open our minds to, a wider diversity of possibilities of how we get there.
Yeah.
And, that might include some things that are in some way emulating natural disturbance. That may involve other things that are not really at all like natural disturbance, but could still get us where we want to go.
Yeah, totally. I totally see what you mean. Like, it's not like throw emulating natural disturbance out the window. We're just like, hey, that may be a tool where maybe in places we can try to emulate like a low severity burn or whatever it might be, or in some places a high severity burn. In some ways we can try and do that, but that's only one of the tools in the toolbox that we can try to utilize for sure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Let's be more intentional. Let's think about this in a way, like, we have so much robust information now, so why not use it instead of just falling back on that concept, which is kind of, as you said, if you think about it from just like a very one-to-one relationship way, we're not emulating natural disturbance. So yeah. Okay. So I feel like you made a good point for maybe rethinking this idea, right? So if we're not emulating natural disturbance, where do we go from there? So the goal is still ecosystem-based management. We're trying to hedge our bets. That's the way I've kind of been envisioning it now. The whole idea of ecosystem-based management in the age of climate change, in the age of severe anthropogenic impact on, the landscape. We're kind of like, hey, we don't know what the future holds for us. We don't know what the climate's going to be like. We don't know what's going to happen. We need to hedge our bets. We need to kind of have as robust and diverse a landscape to make sure that no matter what happens in 50 or 100 years, we still have these services, right? So if that is becoming the goal or the aim of sustainable forest management, how do you think we go about doing that? How do you think we go about thinking about that and changing our system to actually do this differently?
I think the starting point is to think about where we're trying to go, right?
Yeah.
And
we have a clear vision.
Make sure that we know what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Yes.
And then look at the tools to get there.
Okay.
So, maybe to take an example, let's say, we're now faced with, the challenge of climate change, and we want to use our forests. The value that we want from our forest is, say, carbon storage, right?
Sure. Okay.
Okay. So we're going to try and store as much carbon in forests as possible.
Yeah.
To buy ourselves some time to, find other solutions to increasing CO2 in the atmosphere and the problems that are associated with that. So,
at the very least, try to mitigate the amount of fires that exist and are releasing carbon into the atmosphere.
Exactly. Yeah. So you go, okay, well, it's natural. Was this fire natural or not? We could get into a big discussion of what's natural, right?
We still have an emissions problem regardless.
It doesn't really matter if it's natural or not, or if you consider it caused, by human activities that it's not natural, or if you consider that it's because of, weather patterns associated with climate change, therefore it's not natural, it doesn't really matter. It happened, right?
And we got to deal with it.
And we have to deal with it, and we have to think about if that's going to happen in the future. Yeah. So, we want to store more carbon in our forest, and that's going to sustain the forest and sustain, communities in the future. So, doing that might be doing things that are not at all like natural disturbance. So it might involve, trying to manage the forest in a way that fireproofs it, right? Yeah. So that you try and put mixes of species on the landscape that would, slow down a fire or create a less severe fire or protect a community. You might want, to manage in a way so that you could increase the carbon sequestration potential of a chunk of forest, right? So it's going to be picking up more carbon. You might want to take another area and leave it there because it's a big carbon store, and we just want to keep it that way and not mess with it, not touch it and start having it released to the atmosphere. So you think about those are all the things that we're trying to do, and then how do we do that? So, do we plan on a landscape to manage the composition of the forest in a way to say, put some aspen in a purposeful way on the landscape that would help us deal with, issues with protecting infrastructure or values at risk or people in a bad fire season, or would try and help with a bad fire season. Do we somewhere else, do we try and put some really fast-growing trees that very intensively managed primarily for the purpose of carbon uptake?
Sure. Okay.
And then in another area, we think, okay, this area should just be left alone and left as a reserve as a carbon store so that it's not released to the atmosphere. And then you can think about maybe all the other values that you're getting from doing that. Yeah. So that's the kind of approach that I think would be useful. And you do all those things with using the knowledge we have of forest ecosystem. So we know, what we're going to get in terms of carbon uptake in a particular landscape, or if we, harvest forest and then plant again, can we get a net gain between that for uptake of carbon? It depends what you're going to do with what you harvested.
Yeah.
Or is it a better bang for your buck to just leave it alone?
Yeah.
We know how.
And we know both of those exist, right?
Yeah, both of those exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's context dependent. We know how, changing landscape composition of the forest can influence fire behavior, for example.
Yeah.
So we can use our knowledge of that and then use the silvicultural tools that we have to say, okay, we can plant this. So we want some pure aspen here. We want, a mix in another location. We want something else. So that kind of really purposeful thing, and then think, what are the tools to get us there?
I love that, because that's just the carbon.
Mm-hmm. That's just an example, just to say, now we're really concerned with carbon. Carbon may be our biggest thing that we're focusing on to manage our forests for in the future.
Yeah.
And in terms of a commodity, right? In terms of the economic value. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And the impact down the road, for sure. Like and I think it will be interesting to see how switching I won't say the primary value, but the focus from being growing wood to storing carbon, how that would change the way we do things. And who knows, maybe that would be, obviously we're not suggesting that you focus only on carbon and then that'll be the way that we solve everything, right? Is by focusing on carbon. It's like, no, we need to focus on everything, right? And make sure that there's co-values. But it'll be interesting to see how that changes the way we consider the forest, right? Because it's interesting you point out, like, carbon, just doing the carbon thing, we have to talk about fire. We have to talk about, okay, how do trees come back? If you burn a fire versus if you burn a forest versus cut a forest, what is the carbon difference there over 100-year period, depending on what you do with the wood or whatever, right? And the answer varies depending on what kind of species we're talking about and all kinds of different things, right? And even talking about communities, you mentioned, creating fire breaks around communities and that kind of thing. And it's true. Like, we could totally be so much more purposeful, to use your word, around the way we manage these forests, that we can create some kind of, management buffer around communities or around industrial areas to try to reduce the impact of fire, as well as achieve some other goals, as like storing carbon or whatever it might be. And then elsewhere we can do something else. And I wonder if this is kind of stepping away for a second, but I wonder if what holds us back from doing this is the complexity. You know what I mean? Like, the fear of the complexity of this plan, right? Of like, okay, we need to do all this. You're like, forest professionals are looking at this and like, holy crap, like, I would love to do that.
Yeah.
How? Like, how? I don't have the knowledge to do all of this. And so how do we go about doing that? Like, I wonder if that's maybe some of the holdup, or I'm not sure. I think the complexity is a challenge and is a bit of a barrier to doing it, because it's not easy to do those things.
Yeah. And, that's from a practitioner point of view and from a government point of view.
Yeah.
It is not nearly so easy to monitor and assess and determine if regulations are being followed. And,
policies are in the way.
The more complex and variable and flexible you make regulations, the more difficult it is to go and see if people are following them or not. Yeah. And there's only so much capacity. And so that's I think is a really important challenge to doing this, and is a barrier to doing it, probably.
Yeah, probably. That makes sense. But I also feel like I do feel like if we just started, I feel like there's this idea in my mind when I think about it. I'm like, when I first started thinking about this concept of managing this intentionally, like very, on the small scale up to the big scale, and kind of trying to average out, I think the concern is that we may unintentionally start to focus on one value again more than the others, and unintentionally create a new situation that is as detrimental as only focusing on the tree growth, right? And I think people get caught up in this idea where we have to have the perfect plan before we start. Right? And I think in my mind, I think we just kind of need to start. And like, as Gary Merkel said, it's like this concept of sustainability is an ever moving target. We're never going to be sustainable. We're just going to keep moving towards it. It's like every time, so changing every year, we're changing what we do, how we think about it. And we just need to start, and we can, as long as we don't like set ourselves in stone, like this is what we're doing. We're putting it on paper. This is the policy. This is the legislation. We're going this way. That's what we're doing. It's as long as we can create a little bit of flexibility, I think we can start trying. And you can adjust course as thing goes on. But you're right. It's a weird balancing act when you have a Western society with a government the way we have it to try to regulate. And, because if you give too much flexibility, there'll be people who take advantage of it and start.
Exactly.
And so
there's worries that people take advantage of it. There's worries that, people will say, oh, okay, now we'll throw out this natural disturbance based concept and I don't have to do that anymore. And I can go back to, high grading and cutting and burning and, intensive plantations and all that where we were trying to get away from 30, 40 years ago. Yeah. So there's worries that, if you open the door, then, you open the opportunities for a lot of undesirable practices. Yeah. And even if people don't do those undesirable practices, they do these other things, the worry is that what will be the outcome of those. But natural disturbance-based management was a hypothesis. It's still a hypothesis that hasn't been extremely well tested, honestly, even after 30 years. Yeah. All forestry has been, a giant experiment, and we'll do this and see where we get, and continually changing, So another set of questions. Oh, here we are. Okay, we're losing this. We're not getting what we want here. We'll try something different. You can't keep doing progress without trying some different things. Yeah. So
and it's true. And the history of forest management is that, right? That it has changed and does continue to change over time. And so so I suppose it can't be too harsh. Like that is happening throughout our society. We are changing when the values are adjusting and we are shifting. I think maybe it's just not at a pace that we can appreciate, I guess, in our, in a human lifetime, right?
Yeah, it takes a long time for these things
impatient.
to but
we want
forests take a long time to grow. And, trees take a long time to grow, and it's not something that we're going to see fast. But I'm, given those concerns, we still know lots of things that we don't want to do or that we really shouldn't be doing. And there's good historical records. We said we want to do at least sustained yield, right? So we want to make sure we're keeping trees on the landscape. We want to make sure that we're not losing that diversity of values and that we're not, seeing the problems that we've seen elsewhere in the world with, monocultures that are unnatural, or loss of dead wood, or, loss of structural heterogeneity. Loss of multi-aged forests, loss of those values that we know are important. And we know a lot about the things that we want to guard, going forward. So we think, okay, you can always ask yourself, if I'm contemplating this particular practice, what do I think I'll be losing? Yeah. And am I willing to lose that particular thing on this one particular place on the landscape to gain these other values? There's always going to be these trade-offs. Yeah. And then the decision needs to be made when the trade-off is worth it or not. Yeah. As long as we're not doing, undesirable trade-offs everywhere on the landscape. Yeah.
I think, that's a good point. Like this idea of ecosystem-based management, it's like, listen, we still want sustained yield. We still want that. Mm-hmm. That's a good concept that we want. We want to maintain that. Society's only getting bigger. Our demand for wood products, sustainable wood products, is only getting more and more. And so we definitely still want sustained yield. However, we want to add to that a multitude of other things. So so we know we want to keep growing trees. We know we don't want to, disturb water bodies. We want to make sure that they're safe. We keep building bridges. We're not cutting right to the edge. We want to make sure that we're reducing the amount of impact on fish. We know, those are two things that we know we want. We know we don't want to compress the soil. We know, now we're just continue to add complexity, continue to add more function, different ways of doing things. We're just adding to it. So it's not like wipe the slate clean. It's like, no, we're just adding adding to what we already do. Just keep doing what you're doing and then think about it a little more complexly.
Right.
And I think all the forest management, forest professionals want to do, they get excited about this stuff. They want to do this stuff. It's just a matter of like, okay, how do we go about doing it? And I think we just got to start trying, right? Just let's try little things here and there and see how that goes and then change it up, right? Like it's, I know sometimes when I'm doing research for podcast episodes, I'll be writing out questions and I get kind of lost and I'm like, wait, what the hell am I, what is the big picture again?
Where
what
was I trying to go?
Yeah, like, you kind of get lost in the complexity of it a bit, but really it's quite simple. We want to maintain, like, even though it's a complex equation to try and balance, it's still very simple. We want to maintain all the values on the landscape forever, period. So let's just keep trying to do that. And I have faith that we will, that will happen, right? Especially if we keep having conversations like this and pushing it and trying to change it and people want to do it, right? So I think that's the exciting thing, is that we can show that the forest community has changed, forest management community has changed and will continue to change and is currently changing. And now we're just like, okay, how do we want to change? I like that. It's cool.
Yeah.
And I think now is really the only time in history that we've had the ability to do all of this, right? To even conceptualize the complexity of the landscape and like put to words what it is, and to try, like, this is really the first time we've been able to do it, where like the technology is caught up, where the science is caught up, where and we're like, okay, now we have all this. What do we do with it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think, we've learned so much. We've learned so much about the ecology of forests and how they function and what's important for sustaining that diversity of values. We've learned a lot about that,
Totally.
like 30, 40 years ago, nobody really knew how important deadwood was, for example.
Right.
Really, it was considered to be like garbage and really you should clear it out of there because it's just getting in the way of planting the trees.
Totally.
So we've learned, that's just one example of all the things that we've learned about how forests function. So we've learned a lot about that and, developed a lot of tools and technologies now for doing things in a very precision kind of way. So, just like the remote sensing and we can do now, and with monitoring forests and documenting forests and inventorying forests and, even technology that can help us monitor biodiversity and all these things. There's so many things, so much data that we can take advantage of to try and track if we're going, if we're on track or off track, right?
Totally.
With where we're trying to go. So I think, there's lots of opportunity to do things in this more complex but intentional way that, would have been, this is still not easy, but much more possible now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Oh, it's crazy. Like, I think even if technology stopped advancing, if we were just stuck here and we didn't get anything more, the data that we have is more than we can possibly get through. Like now we have multiple LiDAR flights. If people don't know what LiDAR is, it's just it's basically radar from the sky, where you can kind of see how tall the trees are and where the ground is. We have multiple LiDAR flights over like 10, 15 years. So we know how much the boreal forest in Alberta has grown over that time. We can literally just compare the two. We know exactly how much it's grown. We don't have to use yield curves anymore to guess, because we can actually know what happened. And like that information alone is underutilized for the purposes of, because we just don't have the manpower to get through it, the person power to get through it, right? So I think there's so much data that like it's the potential of the use of that data is enormous, right? And we have so much information to play with. It's a really exciting time to be in this world, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of fascinating to think that we have all of this information and we're just kind of trying to figure out how to put it all together and make sense of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, now we have artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence now that can do just frighteningly amazing things.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
So the possibility of putting that together with the data we have to learn and predict and then test and go through that cycle over and over is just really mind-blowing.
I don't think we could even conceptualize what we're capable of doing right now, let alone in the future, right? Like,
Yeah.
Like the concept of, to go back to that concept of deadwood, right? Like, I don't think it wasn't until I read that, the climate change book that you were a part of, right? The one, I recorded that episode a few episodes ago. I can't remember. What was it called? It was called The Boreal Forest in the Face of Climate Change.
Yeah, I should know the
if you go back,
title of the book.
Yeah. I'll make sure the link is in the
put the link in because it's an open access book. So please download it and read it.
Yeah, and it's awesome. It's so easy. Like I said in that episode, it's so easy to read. It's not like this scientific paper where you're trying to, you read every sentence slowly, trying to grasp the full intention of every word. It was written by you guys so that you could read it and understand, and it was easy. And I thought it was a fantastic book.
Oh, thank you.
But it wasn't until I read that book and that chapter on dead wood that I recognized the huge importance of like standing dead trees, right? And not just from the aspect of, a woodpecker can use it or the bugs can use it, but also the impact it has on the area around it, the landscape, the soil, everything. It's just like, it's or even laying dead wood, like just like dead trees on the ground, right? Like post fire, like what that does, the nutrient cycling, how slow that is. And like, the complexity is so intense, but I don't think I really appreciated it until I read that. So that was only 6 months ago or something, right? So, I think just being more robust in our ideas of sustainable forest management and not taking things for granted, right? Because I think even the idea of, I think a lot of times, the idea of leaving residual trees in a stand, whether you're doing a thinning project or whether you're leaving, small or individual trees in a cut block, the idea, there's a lot of times where people wouldn't do it because they're like, well, it's just going to blow over. What's the point? That's a waste of trees. And you're like, well, no, that also has a huge...
What's wrong with a blown down tree?
Right. And now we're changing that idea that like blown over trees aren't necessarily a bad thing. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
If a fire happens, I can tell you, I do forest inventory. I can tell you anytime there's a fire up in the eastern slopes or something on a hill, 10 years later, all the trees within like 300 yards of that fire are blown down on the edge of it. Like it's just, that's part of the natural landscape. So that it just because it's going to blow over is not a reason to not do it. Yeah. Yeah. So there's, I think, and that was a concept again that I've only just started to recognize myself, that it's okay. Those trees don't have to stand forever. They're not intended to stand forever. They're trees. They die too. And it's okay. Yeah. So I think we need to get away from this idea of maybe treating all the trees as like a lumber resource. And you're like, okay, no, this can also be, nutrient recycling or whatever it might be, right? So, there's so much potential there that it's hard to wrap your mind around it all.
Yeah. When you think about our forests, I had a student once that, this was long ago, but the student said something along the lines of, I don't know why people are so concerned about clear cutting. There used to be glaciers here.
Yeah, sure.
And I went, okay, true. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And then I said, since the glaciers left and the first trees started to regenerate on this landscape, no tree ever like left the forest.
Right.
Until we started removing them. Occasionally they'd fall into a river and float downstream and land somewhere else. But every single tree that was born and grew in a forest stayed there, died and decayed, and that went for 10,000 years.
That's a good point. That fiber never left. Like
that fiber never left.
Or I guess to take it away from a forestry perspective, that biological material.
The biomass, really it's just, biological processes taking energy from the sun and CO2 and building biomass.
I like that way. The energy never left.
Energy never really left.
Yeah. Until we came around.
So it's a very, very long-term prospect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you think about, another thing I used to try and hammer home in my class when I taught forest ecology is that the age of the forest is very different than the age of the trees, because you think the age of the forest is from, around here where since the glaciers left, right? That's how old the forest is.
Yeah, the trees come and go through fires.
The trees come and go through multiple cycles, but the organic matter that's built up, the soil development that happened.
Yeah.
All the biological legacies that are in there that are dynamic and turning over time. All of that is 10,000 years old, really. Yeah.
I like that. That's a good way to think about it. So like all of our forests, are ancient forests that are,
our forests are ancient forests, really. Yeah.
At least the ones that are, they're not regrown from an agricultural state or something. But if it hasn't been plowed and the soil been disturbed, then that's an ancient forest. It's just the above ground biomass is new-ish.
yeah, exactly.
I like that. That's a really cool way to think about it. And by the time this one's released, another one, the one prior to this that will have been released episode is it was all about soil microbiomes. So I was speaking with a couple of people from the UBC, and they were talking about the whole idea of underground ecosystems, right? And one of them said something about there's more microbial life in a tablespoon of soil than there is people on the planet.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then they also said there's in a piece of soil the size of your fingernail fingertip kind of size, like a square centimeter, there is over 2,000 centimeters of mycorrhizal matter.
Mycorrhizal matter, yeah.
In that something that small, and so that's the stuff we're talking about when you say like ancient forest. Like that has been around, and it's like it may be disturbed, it may be changed, but that has all been contributing since glaciation, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I love the idea of just like reconsidering our concept of a forest, right, and like what it is, right. I just like that because I think it takes us out of it, allows us to just reconceptualize our preconceived notions of what a forest is and what it means to be a forest, how we need to think about it, all that kind of stuff. I love that. Yeah.
You need to zoom out a bit.
Zoom out or zoom all the way in to the square centimeter of soil, right? Like and that talk really opened up my eyes to the importance of the microbial community in soils and you also considering that as one of the values that we need to be managing for.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah.
So the science just keeps pushing forward. We keep learning more and more, and we need to keep changing with the times. And this all started with the concept of emulating natural disturbance, and we really, but it was good. I feel like we did a good job of kind of pointing out where the holes might be in that concept and giving people an idea that maybe don't throw it out, but like maybe there's other ways.
There's other things we can do. Yeah. And I mean, there's another book, the Ecological Silviculture Systems book that just came out that has chapters for all different kinds of forests. And I co-wrote a chapter in there with colleagues Brad Pinot, Charles Knock, and Phil Como.
Okay. Yeah.
And, we tried to take this kind of approach this intentional kind of approach to say, okay, this is the diversity of forest structures and compositions we have in the Western Boreal in terms of which species and their age and their size. And how do we create these and transitions between them, and just sort of throw out this concept of, a linear development of forest from harvested to some end point.
Right.
Just think, we could start at any point and be trying to go to any point. And what would be the set of tools that we would use to do that?
I like that.
And,
so this book is it's kind of more of like it's very specific on the silviculture.
It's very specific, So it's got a different chapter.
What are the strategies and tools and tactics
for the ecological silviculture systems for all kinds of different forests? And I was looking at it again yesterday, sort of thinking, in preparation for this talk, and I was reading every chapter, and I went, "Oh my God, everybody's saying the same thing," and we didn't even talk to one another. Really, they're talking about the same things. Creating more diversity, silvicultural systems to maintain structural diversity, compositional diversity. retention harvesting for sure is a big one there.
Yeah.
Leaving stuff behind, creating deadwood, leaving deadwood behind, variable density thinning. Many of them mention for creating heterogeneity, but also as a tool that you could use, to help with drought in the face of climate change. So if you want to reduce your basal area, that can be a good way to help trees grow in the face of a drought situation. So you have fewer trees taking up the water. So it's becoming, a really popular idea as a tool that we might need in the face of climate change and if we have increasing droughts in our forest.
That's
and then
cool.
you think, what else do you get with variable density thinning? You can create some other values and achieve some other objectives in terms of heterogeneity of the forest.
Yeah.
And so you can get some synergies between these. You can have a tool that will help you meet one objective, but can also help you meet other objectives as well. So
get creative.
Get creative. Yeah. Get creative, and, in terms of specific, tools for climate change adaptation, planting, dare I say, exotics?
Sure.
Some little experiments with, assisted migration, either with genotypes, provenances, moving them to where, presumably they'll be adapted to the climate in the future, and even some with species. Giving them a helping hand. Maybe if climate change was going slowly, they would be able to migrate into areas naturally. But if things are moving too quickly and they don't have the opportunity, would it be a bad idea to give them a hand? And then we get back to we're really just trying to maintain forests on our landscape. We're trying to maintain the sustainability of all those values. And if if there's a serious issue with trees potentially dying because of drought, for example, at the behind edge on climate change, towards the prairie area of the province, then, what should we be doing to try and deal with that and
totally
be creative?
Yeah, absolutely.
Be a little bit brave.
Yeah. I think it's one of the tools though, right?
Yeah, it's one of the tools. Yeah.
Why not? Like we can be people. We can be intentional. We don't have to emulate natural disturbance. We know a lot of things. And if we go with caution and we go with the best science, then we can do a lot of interesting stuff. And I think that it's totally possible that this can be this is a future system, right? This is totally doable. And the idea of we haven't even talked about the concept of using fire as another tool, right? Like more prescribed burning, more good fire to helping out with having Indigenous communities be responsible for some of the local burning that their ancestors would have done and stuff like that, and just including more of that as well, right? There's so much more involved than just the Western mechanical way of doing things, right? We can also be including other values like that, like you've said several times, right?
Yeah.
But there's so much opportunity there. So if we're trying to, that's one way where we can start to emulate natural disturbance, right? Is introducing more fire that is controlled, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just runaway fires that happen when we're not quite prepared. Right?
Yeah. So it's a bad year to be talking about putting more fire on the landscape.
Oh, you don't say. Yeah, we're minus we're minus how many millimeters of precipitation. Yeah, but it's also it also opens up the opportunity of if you're thinking about it, the windows open up, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's going to be a good year for introducing more fire in the landscape in the future, right?
No, there probably won't.
We just need to be people and trust that we can figure this out.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
we can learn certainly, and
learning,
from Indigenous peoples and their long history with the landscape, and the tools they use to manage it for the values that they needed from that landscape. So much to learn there.
Yeah, totally. And there's so much available, and I think it's just another tool in the toolbox, right? Let's be people. Let's do what people do. And one of the things that people do is start a lot of fires.
Yep.
Western society specifically, we unintentionally start a lot of fires that cause a lot of problems. And if we're intentional about it, maybe that changes the way the forest reacts to us.
Yeah.
So
we do also put out a lot of fires too, it's not the Canadian perspective for sure, but if you go to Scandinavian countries that have boreal forest,
Sure.
and they are suffering the opposite, like a lack of fire.
Oh, right.
And yeah, I mean,
'Cause-
they're reintroducing fire because they want like charred deadwood as a substrate for red listed species, because they so effectively eliminated fire from their landscape that they're completely missing, fire disturbed ecosystems and the values that they provided. So it goes both ways.
Yeah. 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 The boreal is a big place.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's, I really like this idea. And I think this conversation is great because I think it kind of brings in all the concepts that we've discussed over like the whole course of this podcast series, right? It just like kind of brings it all together into like kind of like the higher level. Okay, what are we actually trying to accomplish? Like, what is the big picture? And how is that possible? And where maybe have we been going a little bit astray or been a little bit, not narrow-minded, but a little bit kind of tunnel vision.
A little bit, yeah.
Right?
A little bit, yeah.
Kind of doing this because we know what the consequences are of doing this thing, and they're. From our perspective, it's okay. And we'll just keep doing that unless something else comes up. And now we know that we can do different things. So why not try it? Right. So this is fantastic. So is there anything you want to add to this conversation to maybe just to leave people off? Anything to cap it off? Any ideas that you think might, I know there was this quote that you gave at the end of your Phil's lecture that I really liked, from No Santini et al. We hope that forest management can be viewed, like science, as a never-ending set of questions rather than a series of disconnected truths. And I like that a lot because I realized as I appreciated it, I realized there was about several different ways of appreciating that sentence.
Right. Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I was thinking about it from this perspective, but you could think about it from this perspective. But I like that. Just it's another way of saying, let's start connecting everything and going with the flow. Let's start understanding that this is a dynamic and moving target. And let's treat it as such.
Yeah. That we're always learning and we always have questions. And I liked it because it put science, which is what my career has been, science with forest management, which is what I have been hoping that my research would be informing and benefiting. Totally. And say that both of them are aligned in the way that we have questions, we do stuff, we see what happens, we learn, and then we have another question, and then it just keeps going, and we keep learning, keep improving, and you look back historically through forest management from centuries past, how much we've learned, how much better we do at it now. Totally. And, I'm ever hopeful that with bright people and open minds that we have lots of opportunities to do even better in the future. And we can achieve what we want to.
Oh yeah. No, if you look at the history of forest management and where we are today, we look like we're doing an incredible job compared to what was done in the end, right? But now we know that we can do an even more incrable job. So let's do that, right? Let's lean into it and keep moving and keep changing and not be afraid of doing things differently just because we did things one way for such a long period of time, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah. No, I'm getting more and more of that from guests on the show too, is just that idea of like, let's not be afraid of creativity. Let's not be afraid of trying something new, right? Let's lean into it and be excited and try it. And some stuff might not work out. That's okay. We can do something else. It's fine, right? So the forest is dynamic. It's robust. It's changing. And so should be our management strategies.
Right.
Yeah. Totally. Awesome. Anything else you'd like to add?
That's all. Thanks for the opportunity to come and chat about this. It was really enjoyable.
Yeah, me too. I liked it too. I like these conversations. They're nice to tickle the brain a little bit. And you're like, these are the reasons you get into it, is to have conversations like this, right? So awesome. Thanks so much.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I always enjoy talking to Ellen. There's such a wealth of knowledge there to dive into, and really nice to get to talk to her and get her ideas out there. So, if you have any questions for myself or for Ellen, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you. Make sure to rate and review all that stuff. If you're on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're at, shoot me a rating. Give me the stars. Give a little review. It all helps get this spread out. Also, share it with your friends. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.